Hi, everybody. Welcome to Studio Bridge. Tonight's kind of a special night. We have an extra Monday to work with. So I thought I would do a presentation on. It started out I was going to do a presentation on a series group of artists that all work together that influenced me very much. And then I started thinking, I started investigating, started getting into it, and I think, no, I'm going to just do a presentation on my father. Number one, it's going to make me feel good. Number two, we talk about him a lot. Many of our artists that we're connected to were influenced by him. And truthfully, the Visual Arts Passage and the Illustration Academy, a lot of the teaching that we do was founded from his point of view of picture making. And so I thought it would be a fun night to kind of go through a bunch of his work and show not only what he did and how he grew and matured as an artist, from an illustrator to a painter, and talk about him as a teacher a little bit, an educator, and then go back at the end of this and look at his influences, and then you'll be able to see parts of those artists in his work, of him looking and garnering information from them and applying it to what he did, which I think is a great way to do that, is to take a look at it, an overview at the end. For anybody that's new here to us tonight, if you haven't seen this or been to any of our presentations before, welcome to the Studio Bridge. We're going to be communicating in our Discord channel, and you can ask questions. You can control the conversations. I'm here, Timmy, and by the way, Timmy, hello, thank you for being here. Timmy,
I'll be lurking in the background.
Timmy's going to be helping me with the questions, and may ask a few of his own along the way. But I'm ready to go. This should be a fun ride. I don't know how long it's going to take. It may go quicker than I thought it would. So let's start. My subject tonight is Mark English, and obviously someone I was extremely close to, somebody that influenced the illustration world in a huge way, sent it kind of in several different directions, but somebody that treated his career and being an artist very seriously. He was a very nice, warm, friendly, very personable individual, but he took making artwork very serious. And I'll just give you kind of a brief. He was born in 1933 in a little town in Texas. He had no artists, none of his family member. He had an older brother that was interested in art, which was a good influence on him. It got him kind of started. But he was the only artist that, besides his older brother, that came from the family. There wasn't somebody in front of him that was, showing him the path. He kind of had to figure out his own path. He grew up in a little cotton town in middle of Texas, and kind of worked his way through college. He was in the service, and then didn't get to go to art school, and he went to Art Center in Pasadena for his art education, and didn't really start working in the industry, didn't get a job into the industry until he was almost 30 years old. A lot of what he did, the one thing that he did as a young man is that he learned how to draw. He was a constant drawer his whole life, and he developed that skill, continued to develop. That's what got him into the Art Center and the Art Center College of Design. And he just he had this dream, as he talked about, I listened to him talk about it so many times. He didn't even know he could make a living as an artist until he was in the service and he met several artists, several illustrators. He got very lucky to run into them. And they pointed him, said, if you have any interest in doing this, you need to go to school. And the best school out there at the time was Art Center College of Design. And so he was surprised he got in there. Didn't study painting or illustration while he was there. He studied advertising design. And he always, which was very, I thought, fascinating, because he was such a great drawer, such a great painter. He always considered himself a designer first, a designer that drew, that made pictures. And he always approached everything from a design point of view. So this is Mark in his studio. This is just probably 5 or 6 years before he passed away. And I'll start showing you, I'm going to approach this from 3 major things that he did as an illustrator, a painter, and an educator. As an illustrator, these were projects he did in the early, probably 1964. When he graduated Art Center College of Design, he got a job as in the advertising world, and he got a job working in Detroit, Michigan, doing advertising design. He was jealous of the illustrators. He saw Bernie Fuchs there. He met Bernie Fuchs there. Bernie was about 3 or 4 years, or maybe 5 years in front of him in the industry. And he fell in love with what the illustrators did. And he taught himself how to paint in the evening while he was working as an advertising designer. Mostly all, and the reason Detroit was all, it was all the automobile business, doing catalogs, brochures for the automobile industry. And what he wanted to do, he wanted to be a magazine illustrator ultimately. And he cut his teeth in Detroit, learning how to draw and paint, and started getting illustration work, started doing illustration work for the studio that he was working with. This is from very early on, 1964, and I won't talk about all of these because there's a lot of work in here. The thing I want you to look at and think about my father's work is the evolution. He was obviously looking at impressionists and post-impressionists. That was his first group of artists that he really connected to. And this was his first project from Little Women series that he did when he first moved to New York. And he moved to New York in 1964, Connecticut, actually. And his first printed illustration work were these. And I love to say that this is where he started. How anybody started at such a high level, it still amazes me. These are just beautiful, beautiful pieces of work.
John, it's amazing to hear that he started in his 30s.
Yeah.
He's almost a late bloomer.
Yeah, well, he had to go to the service first. He was an athlete. He got a scholarship to the University of Texas as an athlete. He ran track there, and he got drafted his second year. He thought if he was stayed in school, he wouldn't get drafted, but he did get drafted anyway. And he spent 3 years in the service. A year after that, he got accepted into Art Center. Then he went to Art Center for 3 years and I think he started his first job in Detroit when he was 28 years old, and didn't get into the illustration business really to 64, which he would have been 31, 32 years old at the time. Again, these things are.
Ray just chimed in and said, I wish my first illustration gig was a masterpiece.
Yeah. Brent Watkinson, heard him say that about these pieces, saying this was my first illustration job. And Brent's response was, he said, so when did you do bad stuff? Where's all the bad stuff? You couldn't just start here. That's not right.
Yeah.
And this stuff looks like, you could see it in a history book on post-impressionism.
Right.
And he, again, look at the abstract shapes in his picture, how he groups shapes together to make an overall abstract light and dark pattern on the page. He thinks like a painter, he thinks like a designer. And I think that's one of the things that is consistent and is a thread through all of his work. Grouping whatever light shape that is behind these two figures and the flowers and all of that, and then squint at the piece and see this beyond the figure, seeing this dark and light pattern. And it's a game he played his whole career. A lot of the magazine work that he was doing, this piece, the piece on the right, is titled "The Funeral." Very interesting, and what a small world it was for the illustrators. They all seemed to live in pretty much in the magazine illustrators, the New York magazine illustrators. Most of them lived in a couple of little towns in Connecticut where I grew up. This is Fred Otness, great illustrator. This was my dad's agent, Tom Holloway. That's my father. That's my mother. That's my mother again back there. They used each other as models all the time. And it's fun to see these and see, kind of bring back memories of that. But again, always thinking about design, always and always willing to go somewhere else too. He seemed to always be chasing something. He said he was always chasing something. He just wasn't sure what it was. And this stuff had a real effect on the illustration world in the late 60s. It kind of changed. It took it out of the traditional, where things, this look became something that was even more designed, things like this. And a big part of that was him really, make it, because he had a huge audience. He, for a period from like 1965 to early 70s, he had a piece, like a full page in Ladies' Home Journal, Red Book, McCall's, every month. And, the big format magazines, he did a lot of work for Sports Illustrated. And a lot of people, not only the public, but the illustration world looked at that stuff. And it was kind of it was the venue, it was the place to work as an illustrator at that time. And he was really kind of the last superstar magazine illustrator from the United States.
John, just two things. Your mouse is kind of center. Maybe you could move it off to the
side. I keep pointing at stuff and forgetting. Sorry.
That's all good. And the only other thing I was going to say is, do you think that where do you think his eye for design, do you think that was he just a freak of nature, or did that come from?
Yeah, I explained it a little bit that way. I've seen young, like, students of ours, and learning composition, learning design, I think is the biggest struggle for most people. It certainly was for me. And then every once in a while, somebody comes along, and it's like an innate sense they have. The most obvious one to me is Sterling Unling. Sterling, like, he understood, for some reason, he seemed to understand design at a very young age. My father, I think it's a lot of what he absorbed, the artists that he liked. And I'll show you at the end, if you look at, Eduardo Villard and Pierre Bonnard, Dievenkorn, Klimt, they all have a design thread that goes through their work. And again, they're all very facilitated artists, but the design of the picture kind of trumps everything. And it's not.
Yeah, someone had asked, that there was such a deep understanding of design. It was a mix of graphic and tonal qualities. Can you talk about what prompted some of that, you think?
Well, I think that, again, I think I refer to it as shape design, understanding the construction of a picture, accepting that a picture is a collection of shapes and learning how to control those shapes and learning you have all kinds of freedom if you look at picture making that way. And he was very creative with that. And I think the artists that influenced him were very creative with that. Some of them avoided perspective completely. They had no problems with scale or pairing different languages, visual languages together. Again, as he's growing, as he's learning and getting better as an artist, things take very quick turns. And, my father's one of the few people that you can look at and say, like, when I show you this whole body of work, it could be 4 different, maybe even 5 different, very successful artists in his career. He was like 5 different people. He went major directions. Many, others, somebody like Bernie Fuchs had a couple of really big directions in his work. Gary Kelly's had 2 or 3 really big directions in their work where they made major changes. The one thing in common that I think everybody at the highest end, all the way to Norman Rockwell, is a great sense of design and understanding like abstract design, what abstract design is, and applying it to illustration, applying it to picture making. So, things that were happening here, it's like nobody was doing this stuff when he did it. I mean, he made it popular. And he changed mediums. He was all over the place. At the beginning, I should have said this, he didn't know how to paint. And so he did this original work. This is in crayons. This is with crayons and oil crayons. And he gradually taught himself how to use materials. He was never really concerned with the facilitation as much as the overall picture itself. There was always a message in his teaching that, design the picture first. This is another major shift where he's actually started to use, most of it's oil paint. It's an oil lift out with painted back into. He was using acrylics and gouache and mixed media and collage. He would put things together all the time. This is we just saw Chris Payne's interpretation of what my father was doing with this style. This is a drawing underneath with an oil wash and then lifted out and gone back in with colored pencil. This is something he was doing, early 70s. But again, it's like interpreting things and redesigning what he was looking at. I'll talk more about that when I get to his influences. Other changes, other major changes, different materials, using the airbrush to put tone down. This is an oil lift out. There's always, my dad used to say that there should never be a problem with drawing. Like if something looks like it's, when you're trying to do something that's representational, you can be very loose with your drawing, but it should never look out of drawing. And he's taking these to really high finish where they have a real finished look to them. And the drawing's always impeccable in it. He did, I think, I can't remember how many. I think there's maybe as many as 24 stamps for the government. I'll tell a very funny quick story that the first major stamp he did was the 1976 for the bicentennial, the landing of the Pilgrims. And he did this stamp and he used the Mayflower and the Union Jack flag that was on the Mayflower. And he did his research. He got everything right. Remember this, the originals only, they required you only work 6 by 6 inches at the time. I don't know what it is now. And this is kind of pixelated, I apologize. But he worked pretty, you had to work fairly small doing the stamp. And I think it was no more than 10 times up. That's what Chris Payne said the other night. So this flag, can you imagine he's got the whole Mayflower in the ship, and there's a flag at the top of it, a little tiny flag, and the ship's only half the size of the stamp. And so somebody with a microscope discovered he used the wrong flag. And the first time that my dad's work appeared in the art section in the New York Times was Illustrator makes major blunder. That's literally what it said. And
I bet that stamp's worth something.
a 12-year-old, and they were trying to decide if they were going to continue the stamp on. It came out on the first day, one of the first day issue, and then they ended up deciding, no, we're not going to change it. We're going to go ahead and use it. We're going to accept the problem. But a 12-year-old philatopist, that's a stamp collector, discovered that my father had made a mistake in his research and used the wrong Union Jack flag on it. It was the flag had changed during the time period. And so
that's amazing.
If you want to get on the front page of the art section of the New York Times, just make a mistake.
Somebody asked, you talked how he painted store windows when young. Do you think that helped him with design and composition?
I don't know if it did or not. I've seen some of those photos, and he didn't know much about it at the time. The funny part of what it was is he, was a kid, 13, 14 years old. And he lived in this little town in Texas, and they had the rodeos come through. And that was always, Friday night rodeo. And and his father owned the grocery store in the town. And and he saw his father paying this guy $75 to paint the sign in the front window of his store. And it took him like 2 hours. And he said at the time in 1946 or 47, it would have taken him a month to make $75. He's like,
hey, that's like an election.
That's what I want to do. I love art. And he goes, I love the fact that somebody will pay good money for it. And so by the time he was 15, he became that guy's competitor. And he was painting storefronts all over these little towns in Texas, which I thought was pretty ambitious, very entrepreneurial. He was born to be an illustrator, I guess. The piece on the right is George Rogers Clark, and Custer, obviously, on the left. The funny thing about George Roger Clark, which this is so smart on my dad's part, is that nobody really knew what he looked like. There was really no rendering of him, and so they didn't know what his likeness was. And notice the lighting. That's called bar lighting, straight down. And a lot of illustrators have used bar lighting over time, or when they don't want to show personality in a portrait, or a personality, they just want it to be a figure in a background, and so they have bar lighting, and it becomes less of a portrait. And since since there was really no likeness of him, they thought, try to make it more everyman than just somebody trying to create a very specific look for him. I thought it was pretty intelligent. And then you can see my dad was as others, but he loved the tangent and loved to play. We always talk about bad tangents in study hall or in class, and there are bad tangents, but they're all good tangents. When you can functionally make things line up, like this light on the back of the ear and the back of the neck and the collar and the vest, playing games with that. And it can be very, very effective. And he dug into it real heavily. The Reagan cover, and obviously Jacques Cousteau on the right. different materials, the Reagan cover. This was something that just blew me away, because you look at the date, 1982, I was 21 years old, and I was trying to develop myself as an illustrator and was getting some illustration work. And I remember him doing this job for, it was a big thing, doing a cover, time cover of Ronald Reagan. And he got approval for a couple of sketches he did on Wednesday evening. And he had to have the piece in. That's just how it was. There was no digital delivery. You had to have the piece in New York on Friday morning. In his case, he had to get it. He lived in Kansas City at the time. He had to get the piece in FedEx by, I think at that time it was like 9 o'clock on Thursday night. He did 3 paintings. He submitted 3 pieces. So from Wednesday to Thursday, he did 3 covers. This wasn't his favorite one. This was one of 3 that he submitted. This is the one they chose. And he knew, at that time, and they still do, when you're doing covers, they have multiple artists, they have photographers, and they usually have 3 or 4 things to choose from. He was going to make sure he got the cover. And so he did three images for it. Extremely fast and facilitated. Again, he would always say, make the picture, and especially those magazine illustrators during the 60s and 70s, they worked very quickly. They had to produce quickly. They had techniques and materials that they used, and they approached it that the image itself was not the finished piece. The printed piece was the finish. Seeing it in print. And so long as it looked good in print is all they cared about. And that's how my dad thought doing illustration work. This is not made to hang on the wall. It's made to be printed. And some of it's beautiful. My sisters and I own a lot of this work, and it's gorgeous stuff. Some of it is collaged and taped together. A lot of it, he started being very, careful with his work as he got older, and there was, realized there was value to it. This was towards the end of his illustration career, when he was really kind of getting interested in painting. And these were illustration projects, actually. And I think the one on the left was a cover of the Society of Illustrators. And he didn't know what to paint when he decided that he wanted to explore painting. And I think he just started, like most do, he started to do figurative work, and he started to do landscape work. And he also started to do still life work. The piece on the left is for Bram Stoker's Dracula. The piece on the right is for Rolling Stones, Pete Townsend. Again, there's that bar lighting on the one on the left. You don't want to, you want the figure to indicate Dracula, not to be and look how close he pulled those values together and how subtle the features are. He wanted the shape to be Dracula, but he didn't want to get into the minutiae of his features. The one on the right is a technique I've never seen anybody else do. That is marker paper with new pastel, but totally he would use dry new pastel. He would take the marker paper and cover it with paint thinner, Gamsol or whatever, and he would take the dry pastel and work it into turpentine, and it would just set immediately. It was very difficult. You had to just nail it, and it was very difficult to maneuver. You did have an opportunity for a short period of time that you could lift some of it off, but I've watched George Pratt and John Foster. I've tried it a number of times. You better know where you're going when you use that technique. It takes a tremendous amount of facilitation, and it's a lot of reacting. It's the most active material that I've ever tried to control. Eddie Bauer covers, again, very different materials. This is a combination of oil and an acrylic underpainting with an oil wash over the top and then back into it with oil paint. This is a combination. The one on the right is he started with that new pastel. That's what you're looking at with all this bright color on paper. And this is all painted back into with the caustic waxes and scraped back into. Again, materials were just a playground for the guy. He loved to explore different materials. And look at how nothing's finished. This is all about gesture, energy, and shape. This is an ad for Miller Beer on the left, and the one on the right is for Mohawk Paper. This is one of my favorite two illustrations that he ever did, and I actually have them both. This was the cover of Atlantic Monthly, the Sigmund Freud on the left. The one on the right is the interior piece he did. And then he did a couple of drawings, spot drawings that went with it. It's a beautiful series. This is on Canson paper with Prismacolor pencil and dry brush oil paint and crayons back into it. Very different way of working. I only show one of these, or maybe two, I don't know, but he did all 33 Shakespeare plays for Bantam Books. They, for a long time, they hung, I don't know if they still do, they hung in the Bantam corporate headquarters. And they were a combination of the medium I just explained. Some direct oil paint, some straightforward, more done in pastels. They kind of wandered all over the place, but they were a knockout. It's probably the best illustration project. You know, think about it. You got 33 book covers in one project and Shakespeare plays. You have a narrative that's, you know, very forgiving and a lot of opportunity with the narrative, a lot of different ways to interpret it. It was just a total playground for him. And it was probably my favorite thing I've ever, you know, as an illustration project that I've ever seen anybody do. They ended up buying all the originals and hung in their headquarters for a long time. Another book cover on the left. And this was a poster for a ballet company. Combination of oil crayons, crayons, and oil paint. Baseball, Babe Ruth. Take it back. This I don't know what this was for. This is a Dickens, obviously, story. This may be one of the Shakespeare covers. I can't remember. Again, you'll start to see his drawing go from this really precise, very accurate drawing and wander. Sometimes there was no drawing, there were no features, just shape. But then some of the things got really wild in their drawing. When he was transitioning from illustration to painting, he said the thing that he had to get away from, the first thing he had to get away from was being painting pretty people. And he said he really got tired of it, over doing it over a long period of time, trying to make everybody look pretty. And that was a big part of working for the women's magazines. And so he gave himself a project to do, and I know it started out is to do 100 paintings, portraits from memory, where he didn't look at any photo reference. And he wanted to see how far he could take. And he realized he had painted so many heads before that he could get pretty far and make it believable. But they became so much more interesting because he was much more creative with it. And he started out with 100. He ended up doing hundreds of them. I know that because I own a lot of them.
Here's a question from Paul.
Sure.
Sorry to cut you off, John.
No, that's fine.
In the Ronald Reagan piece, how did Mark create such a tight white house drawing in the background over the other mediums? But
He did it in Prismacolor pencil. It was drawn, that was on a Canson paper. And, or, he used Prismacolor pencil, crayons, which are oil crayons, and oil paint together. They all worked really well together. The Prismacolor will melt with oil paint, will blend into the oil paint, so will the crayons. And he could be very precise with the pencil. And then he could be very loose with the oil crayon and the paint. And he would use those three together to control the looseness and the tightness of them. I think that's a pretty good explanation.
Bill also asked, do you think that he sent work in when it was still wet, given that he worked in oils?
No, he came up with that approach because it might have been damp, but you could put a piece of paper on it and pack it, and it would, the paper, like construction paper or packing paper, wouldn't stick to it. And the paper was so absorbent, it soaked up. I mean, it dried very quickly. There's tricks you could do too. You could use like alkyd burnt umber and alkyd white. If you're controlling your value in your oil paint with your color pieces, it would make all the other paint dry very quickly. He didn't use any other kind of dry. Well, there was one kind of dryer, like a wind gel, or which is very similar now to a Galkyd gel. It comes in a tube, and it will dry your paint very quickly. Also, as a painter, those are good questions, by the way. As a painter, he started out very representationally, and the figure. This is giving him credit to his great drawing skill and his sensitivity to handling a figure. Remember, most of what he was painting in those love stories in those magazines were people. And so he did a ton of figurative work, and he learned how to control emotion by, subduing the features, focusing on gesture and shape, and message in a way that most people don't figure out early as painters. Getting to, having a mood created by, mood and emotion to the way you render and finish. And of course, all about design. I mean, look how beautiful that portrait is on the right. I mean, it's just stunning and so delicate. The paint that's like a 30-inch piece. That piece is like 30 inches tall. The piece on the left is like 4 feet tall. Look at that hand. I mean, so elegant in the way that that he drew. A lot of the figurative work that he did became wilder, more fun. I didn't understand a lot of it. I'm trying to be a better drawer and painter. And then he's trying to forget how to draw and paint. He's forgetting how to, I want to get away from being so realistic with the work. And it was we were kind of going in opposite directions. I used to joke about it. I said, can't you draw a little bit more on that? Because it's exactly what he was battling. Love the still life in this thing right there. It's gorgeous. That thing's huge. It's 5 feet across. And all of this came from him going to life drawing sessions, drawing the model, drawing figure, trying to get away from being so tied to reference. He would use reference, and then he would get away from it. And there was a lot of times he didn't use reference.
John, this might be kind of a silly question, but for some of his work, especially in his later years where it was maybe more abstract, did he have a narrative that he ever shared with you that was attached to some of his paintings? Or was it all just kind of what he thought was an interesting design solution?
It's interesting. his narrative, I think, was his life experience. And I look at the things he painted and some of my favorite things that he did and the things he loved to do late in his career. And he reverted back to the things he was interested in, the things he saw as a child. He would draw, he grew up in, in a rural area. He was around cows, he was around horses, he was around chickens, and that's what he painted. He painted farms, pastoral scenes, rural scenes, and it was just like this. He loved being outside. He loved environment. He did things that he thought were very, that were beautifully this, ordained, like ornate in their in the clothing. The American Indian, he loved geisha. He loved any kind of symbolism that was related to, historically. And he would go on tangents of, like researching in like the American Indian. He liked it for different reasons for what most people liked it for. He loved and he even collected some of it, of the patterns in the clothing. And he would get interested in something like that, and that became his interest in painting for a while. He only painted what he wanted to, and he was never dictated by, after the illustration world, he was never dictated by a gallery. He would do the work and he would send it to them. They would say, "Oh, I want this." They might say this sells better than others, but he would really only paint what he felt like painting. And that's one of the more difficult things as an artist, is to kind of figure out and discover what it is you want to paint. Can you grow in that subject matter? Can you do it for a long period of time? And then will people be interested in it? My father was always very direct. Grew up, born in the Depression. Making money was part of it. He didn't hide from that. This is how he made his living. He wasn't like, he always thought that if I could just be successful enough to be able to make a living, that would give me more time and more peace of mind to grow as an artist. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think that you hear the starving artist, like you're pushed to do things. Well, the starving artist has to do something to make a living and doesn't get to spend all their time making art. And that was my father's theory anyway. And I've always thought that way too. It's like, if you have a way to monetize your work, then you can do better work. You can do more of it and you can be more invested. And that's where my dad drew the line as a serious artist. You paint what you want to paint. You make it the best you can possibly do. You don't worry about if it needs to be something you love. You don't worry about the subject matter, that it's what somebody else wants. You do your subject matter your way, and then you can control it that way. And you just be damn good at it. It's what he would always say. Just be so good at doing you. But you got to figure you out. Portrait of Abe Lincoln on the left. Everybody knows it's Abe Lincoln. Got to look for him a little bit, but all those very polished pieces I showed you at the beginning, this is what he was doing 30 years later, 40 years later, 50 years later. One on the right is just maybe. It's nobody. Somebody did it. Something he did from memory. These are some of my favorite things. I love portraits with no features, with no faces. He did a lot of things like that, either dark or very light.
John, you might appreciate this. I'm trying to remember the name of the artist quote. I think it's Kooning. The trouble with being a poor artist is that being poor takes up all your time. it's a good,
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a job in itself being poor.
yeah, it's very difficult.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's what William de Kooning. The portrait of, I love this jockey. That's just so great. You know, that, you know, you can see his influences there. I would immediately go to Degas or Bonnard. I would go to Degas with the subject matter and Bonnard with the finish.
AJ asks, on these large pieces, would he grid them out or use a projector or kind of go with the flow and draw, adjust, erase, adjust?
On the paintings, AJ, he would take a little 2-inch thumbnail, stick it to his drawing board, and he would never like measure anything. He would just draw it from his thumbnail. And he stayed very true when he did this, all of this. I'll show you some of it here in this document. I have it in this slide deck. Some of it, what some of his thumbnails and preliminaries look like. But he would solve all of the design issues, not all of them, because you have to design color and texture, but all of the value, the division of space, the light and dark pattern. He would solve all of that in his value study, his thumbnail, and he would stay true to it. And he'd always tell students, it's like, why would I, once you solve it at 2 inches, you don't have to worry about it. It works at any scale. And why would you invest the time in doing a finish if you don't know where you're going? If you know where you're going, the worst thing to do is to be doing a large scale painting and have to move something or take something out. He goes, you don't have to if you get the value structure right, you get the picture right in thumbnail. Then when you go to do the finish, exploring the media, exploring the mark making, the materials, that's where all the excitement and fun is. You've already solved the picture part. Now you get, or at least the compositional elements of it. Now you gotta make it exciting and have fun. And he would always leave that in. He didn't like doing color studies for that reason either, because he wanted the color to happen on the finish. Something else I'll point out, a lot of his paintings look really complicated, and they're actually really simple design as far as light and dark pattern, as far as shape. And then he had the attitude, like, if you can keep the design simple, then you could make the media complicated. It was so much easier. If you have to do 30 individuals, 30 figures in a painting, you can't be it's very difficult to play with that material and make those small figures read as figures. If you're doing big, simple shapes, you could have all kinds of fun with the mark making in the material. Something I know that AJ understands because he's very good at it. It's one of my favorite paintings. I remember walking to his studios and seeing this, and he was so proud of this painting. It's about 5 feet tall. Man with Gun. That's all it is. That was the title. I love it. What reason that guy has a gun, I have no idea. Don't know what he was saying.
I was really wondering, like, does he have a narrative or a story he tells himself when he's making these images? Like, like that. Yeah.
I think he's just playing around. He's got multiple man with knife, man with gun. But I really did this, it was fun.
Weaponized man. I'm noticing a theme.
This is back to like some of his early landscape. Again, like as he started with painting his figurative work, look at that figure compared to what he was doing at the very beginning with his figurative work. Look at this landscape. How much more straightforward. It's very impressionistic. It's very pretty. And definitely he takes liberty with design on everything. It's beautifully done. But watch how they change. There's some still life painting. I love the one on the left. Here's that material. Here's some landscapes with that wet pastel. That's pastel on paper. So is this. And then the landscapes just started really getting intense. And lots of material. The dark that you're seeing in this all these browns. He started using tar as his darks in all of his paintings. And sometimes he would cover the whole board with tar and remove it and use that as the dark in his pictures, his roofing tar. It has a great warmth to it. It has this like beautiful sepia color to it, and it works with oil paint really, really well. Some of these things are very large, but these are all made up landscapes. They're not, he had no reference on any of this stuff. And he would just sit there and do hundreds of thumbnails with pattern and dark and light. And I mean, dark and light, simple shapes with busy pattern next to it, breaking up, dividing the spaces up. And I'll show you what some of them look like later on. But he would work from these little thumbnails, but these were all invented landscapes. I mean, the media use alone is spectacular. But again, that's a really simple picture shape-wise, but very complicated when you get to the materials and color. That's one of my favorite ones. Another big, it's probably 4 feet square. The other thing he would say about his landscapes, he goes, I approach them as an abstract painter. And he goes, and what I realize, if I do an abstraction and I put a horizon line in it, it becomes a landscape. And that's really what he was doing. He was just playing with shape and pattern and then put a sky in it. And then all of a sudden it's a landscape. Okay, back to progression of things. This was the first, he did probably 100 horses. This is the first painting of a horse that he did and I'm sure he painted them in illustration before, but the first painting as in a painting, it's a 6-foot oil painting of this Lipizzaner white horse against a dark background. And that's how he was painting in 1980, 1982, maybe 84, I don't know, somewhere in that time range. And then they started to change. They started to, get looser, get wilder, and then started distorting the horses. His point of view of drawing had changed. Probably painting without much reference, if any. And then he just went nuts with them and did some of my favorite things that he ever did. This is really funny. That painting on the right is huge. It's like 6 feet tall. I don't know if Timmy remembers this, but we brought it into our booth at Spectrum. And I thought, hey, that's a fantasy piece. It's a horse with wings. It fits in Spectrum. That thing got so much attention.
I do remember that. Yeah, it was like that was the early days of the Academy, ended up at Comic-Con. We were at Comic-Con, actually. Well, Spectrum at Comic-Con.
Yeah.
And it's like, if it doesn't have wings on it, it doesn't work.
That's funny. That was John Foster. John and I were sitting in our booth, John and George and I. And John is looking around at all the artwork that he could see from where he was sitting. He's like, hits me in the shoulder. He goes, John, look around. He goes, there's not one picture anywhere that doesn't have a wing or a scale in it.
Yeah.
I thought that was so great.
You got some horns that could go with this?
Yeah. But look where he took this stuff. And he got so creative with his collage. I just went, I live in Kansas City, and we're very lucky to have a very successful professional football team right now. I took my son to the game yesterday with a group of friends, and they have this beautiful club seats, and you have to go through this area that it's in the Chiefs Stadium. And I forgot that my dad did this, that the Kansas City, the owners of the Chiefs, the Hunt family, commissioned him to do an 8-foot painting of that used to be the mascot of the Chiefs, called War Paint, the horse. And so I walked right into this thing yesterday. It was so much fun to see it. Right. My son and my friends that I were with got such a kick out of seeing this. They have this, like, it's really, they've featured it really well. This beautiful, Mark English painting right in the middle of the Chiefs Stadium. But I mean, he was so creative with these, and he let himself explore. He wandered. And he was always trying something different. they got really wild towards the end. But there's a perfect example. And this is just a sampling. Finding a subject matter that you're interested in, that you think you can make good pictures with, and running with it and staying with it for a long period of time. Here, we're going back 40 years to that original white horse. And he probably did several hundred of them along the way.
John, did Mark sleep a lot?
Pardon me?
Did Mark sleep a lot or sleep well?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
He's the king of naps.
Really? Was that like
He
really?
he loved to take naps, but he also, I knew it when I grew. Okay, I'll explain something. My perspective of being an artist when I was young, as my father was an athlete, I was an athlete as a kid, young adult, and I was around. I wish I would have known more as a child. I mean, I was around all these great artists, all these great illustrators. People bring people. I was listening to Chris Payne and I were joking about it the other day. Chris Payne would he talked about Kobe Whitmore. He talked about Al Parker. He talked about Austin Briggs. I've met all those people. They were friends of my father's, Al Parker. And then the contemporaries, his friends, Bernie Fuchs, and those guys were insane. They were so caught up into their work, and it was wonderful. I saw the joy in it. But what I saw from my father is he worked really hard. I think I'm bringing this back to the sleep question. As an illustrator, there was times that I know he missed sleep because he pushed himself really, really hard trying to be good. As later on as a painter, he worked hard, but he never lost sleep. I think he was just consistent. And, the thing that I took away from it when as a child was like, I don't want to do that. I'd have to work all the time. As I got involved, when I started to discover who my father was and what he did and the impact he had on his industry, I became very interested, and it kind of, intrigued me. I didn't start drawing until I was in my late teens, 16 or 17 years old. I was 16 actually. And again, it was for that reason. I was exposed to it. I knew a lot. I kind of developed an aesthetic because that's all I looked at. It was all over our house, all the magazines. They were all slanted to the arts. And I knew who the artists were just from being told. But I didn't have any technical skills. The technical skills were easier to come up with than the aesthetic, I think. Developing an aesthetic is, I think, extremely important for an artist. Looking at the right artists, really diving in and figuring out what they're doing. Being consistent. This isn't, I think, what you have to figure out as an artist. This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. Eat the elephant one bite at a time. Don't burn yourself out. And people ask my dad that question all the time. They said, "Did you ever burn yourself out?" And he goes, I got tired, but I was doing what I wanted to do. He goes, I don't see where burnout should come into it. He goes, I never felt like I didn't want to do this. This is something I always wanted to do. And I think that, that's happened to me. It's like as I age, I get more, it becomes more valuable to me. Time becomes more valuable to me. And so I put more effort into it. Some American Indian. Again, he fell in love with the pattern. Some of the figure stuff that starts coming up. Piece on the right, my sister owns 5 foot tall painting. Might even be 6 feet tall. It's huge. It's in her home. And it was his for a couple of years anyway. It was his favorite painting that he ever did. He loved it. One on the left is gorgeous. But again, taking simple subject matter and making it complicated with material. And then simplifying complicated material. Bernie Fuchs was a master at that. Do these crowd scenes. Look like a crowd, but they'd be so simplified, but you have a great feel to it. I should probably go faster here. What are we doing? We're an hour into this. Whole series, a constructive series, architectural stuff. He was always using architectural in his illustration, and he liked to paint it, but he made up his architecture. And he shot photos of houses, like dilapidated houses, or just interesting architecture he thought was interesting, things that he thought had homes that had a gesture to it. And he actually did this. I don't know if it was this one or one very similar as a demonstration at the Academy. And he started by gluing bits and pieces of the house together. And he moved it like he did a drawing, he cut it all apart, and then he glued it back together where it was not, how it should have been. It was all off register, trying to create interest. The one on my right, I absolutely love. Some geishas.
John, Sally, and Christy are listening, and they want to know, do you have a favorite era of your dad's paintings?
I have several. It's like all kind of runs together for me. I totally like. You recognize the one on the left, don't you? To me, it hangs at your dad's company, your dad's office. It's right when you walk in the door.
Yeah, it's right in the entrance.
Yeah, and I love when he would show off his drawing. Because he handled the figure so well in such a delicate, graceful way. I love that type of work, and I was always an encouraging, and he did. Sometimes he actually listened to me. He would go back in not on one particular piece, just on the subject matter. He would go back and do more figurative work, and he would come to drawing with me, and he would turn those things into paintings. And I love the fact that he could do that, but just his out and out design. And I'll show you what I mean here, because it gets even more serious. Just thinking about design, that's coming up here pretty quick. I love when it was just totally hinged on the composition. This is a whole series. I think I have 6 of these that are a series that he did. They were just, imaginative heads that he painted. For no reason. He never showed them anywhere. He just did them to see if he could do them. They were never for sale. It was just him playing and having fun. Look at the piece on the left. As soon as I said that, my dog came over and looked at it. And he was really, he would wander a lot. He was all over. He would bounce from architecture of doing these cities, just playing with shape. And then all of a sudden it became pure abstraction. And he was a great abstractionist. And he has a whole bunch of this stuff that was left to my sisters and I that was never shown anywhere. It was just things he did trying to learn how it worked. He was one of the most curious artists that ever walked the planet, I think. Love this one. This one hangs in my house. It has for the last 20 years. It was funny. He did that like in the 90s. Did a whole series of these abstractions, never showed them to anybody. Gave a bunch of them away as Christmas gifts to my family. And then picked it back up 20 years later. Then I think I'll go back there and I'll start doing that again. And these were, the last few years of his life. I think that's the last abstraction that I'm going to show. And the last painting I'm going to show. I'm going to talk to him about being an educator. I just want to put, I love this photo, all these photos. This is at the Academy. That's Francis Vallejo right there. That's the great Chris Ron sitting right there. Oh man, I can't think of her name. That's terrible. She's I totally apologize. I'll think of it. That's Doug Chaka. So many good artists learn from him, develop themselves. It was funny when he would draw, it's like the room stopped. And so some things he did, he created the Illustrators Workshop, which became the Illustration Academy. The Illustrators Workshop were these guys: Bob Heindel, Fred Ottness, Bob Peak, Alan Kober, Bernie Fuchs, and my father. They were all very close friends. They looked at each other as peers and adversaries. They competed against each other a lot. This shot is my favorite. This was in my father's studio in Connecticut, and he had converted this barn. It had a big loft in it. And this was wonderful working space. There's the artists at the workshop. Here's some of the illustrators that went to the workshop, myself included: Chris Payne, Anita Kuntz, Thomas Blackshear, Matt Mahurin, Michael Dudash, Bill Vaughn, Dick Kreppel, Walter Rain, Rick McCollum, and many, many more. This was our first advertising for it. We wanted it to be about foundations, but we wanted it just as we are now. It's like learn from artists that do this day in and day out, and learn from people that have the skill sets, that apply the skill sets all the time. And so we were always looking for people from the industry. These are artists that have taught with us at the Academy. Pretty interesting list, right? You see Bill Sienkiewicz and Ian McKay and Natalie Hall and Wesley Burt and Edward Kinsella. A lot of them were our past students. There's my great friend George Pratt, Brad Holland, Gary Kelly, Anita Kuntz, John Collier. I mean, just amazing talents. They all came and they taught with us. And I recognized as a young guy, I was by far the youngest one of the instructors when we started, until some of our students started teaching with us, until Sterling started actually. And I recognized they all came because they wanted to be in the room with my father. They wanted to be with him, to work with him, to learn, to teach with him. And it was a great experience. It was fantastic. And kind of the trickle down, I want that same mentality of community in everything we do. Illustration Academy. These are all people, many of them are speakers, many of them are artists that teach with us that went to the Academy. These people are responsible for, we're real close to 40 medals at the Society of Illustrators from our past alumni. You can, there's great, I'm not a disbeliever of art and design school. I'm a disbeliever of the reality of it, price and their approach, but there's good things that you can learn if you can afford it to go to art and design school, but nobody can point their finger at that kind of success. These are rock stars in the industry. Our instructors at the Visual Arts Passage, and many of them studied with my father. Most of them studied with my father, actually. And this is kind of what happened. Notice there's Bill Sienkiewicz, there's George Pratt, Hector Casanova, that's Natalie Hall peering around the corner. And all of these people are watching my father draw. That happened every time he would start drawing. And the other artists would stop and they would want to see what he was doing. He was like a beacon. And everybody wanted to watch what he was up to. He had a great way of explaining picture making. This is a long time ago. There's Chris Payne in the background. There's myself. There's Gary Kelly, Andrea Wickland. And again, he'd start drawing. People would watch. This goes on.
Just remember having to tell Bruno, like, hey, we're going to need you to sit down.
Step away from the artist, Bruno.
Yeah.
You're getting a little too close.
Bruno is like Academy royalty as a student. I think he's in the running for attended most times.
Yeah. That's Bill Sienkiewicz watching my dad do a demo. This is, I think, the last Academy, watching him draw. Okay, these are some of my dad's. I mean, I have piles of these things. This is where all his picture, he was a totally process-driven artist. He was an illustrator. That illustration is a process-driven industry. As a painter, he was a very process-driven painter. Many painters are, most are. And developing this way was so important. He would always say, this is when your time is the least inexpensive. You could spend you could do hundreds of different pictures and little small thumbnails. And then something good would happen and you would start digging in on one and dive in and make it a complete picture. Going through that process was so important. And that's what he taught. Some of his landscapes that he did. Again, he's not looking at anything. He's just putting shape down, trying to make up, here's a finished painting from this little thumbnail. Which one of these thumbnails right here? He did a thumbnail. He's going to take it to a finished painting. Doesn't need any reference. It's a very loose, very primitive, almost painting for him. He taught a very specific drawing technique, which we call the Academy drawing technique. All of our instructors started drawing that way, and they drew with us that way. I really learned how to draw the figure that way. It's not how I first learned, but I went back to it, and my father came up with this method to simplify it for the students. And what he said, this type of drawing is more effective for picture making because it's identifying the shape of the figure first. And it applies to picture making much more so than developing in line and gesture. You're learning to get the gesture and the weight transfer, your proportions, everything by identifying the shape first, just getting the overall silhouette shape down first. These are some of his demos he did for students. He was great at it. These are 15, 20-minute drawings. They're big. They're on 30-inch pieces of paper.
John, Nicole asked, did he ever use a fountain pen? Or did he ever use pen ink?
Not on his figurative work, not on the figure drawings himself. He used to use it in his sketchbook all the time. And he used to use a fountain pen, like drawing up finished pieces. There was a painting of a black horse that I showed earlier. You could see some of the ink drawing in it. And then he would paint up against it with acrylics.
AJ asks, did he have an opinion regarding digital artwork?
No, he learned. Arnie Finner was given the task when Arnie worked at Hallmark to teach my dad digital skills, which was not worth doing.
Monumental task.
It had to be a little frustrating, I think.
Oh yeah.
But Arnie joked about it a lot. He said he made beautiful pictures. He didn't know what he was doing, but if I would do what he said, it was very evident that he understood design in a way that very few do. He said, you give him any kind of a tool and he'll come up with a great picture. This is very similar to what Chris Payne did, not drawing in color pencil, but this is him drawing with just charcoal and black and white, and seeing his process through that, hanging on to your original drawing, putting flat acrylics down, putting an oil wash over the top of it, lifting it out with kneaded eraser, going back in with Prismacolor pencil. He even would go back in with an airbrush and lighten the flesh. And then he went back in and spattered his. And that was about an hour and a half long demo from start to finish. But it was his interpretation of to me, you can see the photograph. I mean, he changed the hairline, the collar was, all that stuff was made up. It was like props, and he made it all believable. And it's all about shape design. What was going to be the best shape of Dracula? And he really made him look like a Dracula. Here's some fun photography. Edward Kinsella on the far right, Sterling Hunley, myself, my father, and George Pratt. That's the great Baron Story and my father. They actually went to art school together. Contemporaries as illustrators. Baron was there for just the last semester that my dad was there. Baron's a little bit younger than my father. Chris Payne and my father. There's Gary Kelly and Terry Brown, who was the president and director of the Society of Illustrators for a quarter of a century. This is us at Wyeth at Brandywine. Brad Holland and my father. This is the last year we did the academy. This photo kills me. These three guys are the three most awarded artists in the history of the Society of Illustrators. It's Brad Holland, my father, and Gary Kelly. And my dad would always joke. He said, if I didn't stop painting, if I didn't stop doing illustration work when I was 50, I'd still be in the league. I started painting and I quit doing illustration. He was joking. They were good. My dad was very good friends with Brad and Gary. But they're giants. Bill Sienkiewicz, Chris, and my dad. Anita Kuntz. The idiot with the glasses on and back is me. There's Carla Ortiz, one of our guest artists at the Academy. This is Jeffrey Allen Love. Victo Nye, John Foster. This is Scott Richardson, a friend of the Academy. That's obviously Edward and George and my father. A bunch of our students. This is us at Brandywine. And this was a long time ago. I love it. See Sterling, right? This is the first year he taught with us. In that crowd is Sterling. There's Terry. There's George Pratt. That's Greg Spolenka, his wife Roxana, Gary Kelly, Robert McGank. Who else is in there? This is Cassandra Loomis right there.
Wow.
And she was a student with us. Brent Watkinson.
Is this the 90s?
This is 2002.
Okay.
Long time. Stephen Hughes, Britton Edwards. If I think about it long enough, Matt Fallenstein, if I think about it long enough, I can probably come up with everybody. Okay. After seeing a bunch of my dad's work, this will be, this I think will hit home well. Bonnard was probably the biggest influence of my father, more than any artist. This is the one, especially at the beginning, and he kept going back to him. And I remember going to Paris with my father when I was 20, and it's like he would just stand in front of these things and just kept, it was like, just kept pointing out to me, like, look at that, look at, he was so in love with these pictures. And you can see my dad in here. You can see where this design developed. You can see where some of these other artists that I'm going to show you came from too. I mean, you cannot say that Richard Diebenkorn didn't love Pierre Bonnard. Just phenomenal work. If you haven't, as an artist, and you haven't, like, maybe somebody you wouldn't think of looking at right away, try to dig down and figure out why other artists like them so much. This again, when I was into the phase where I was really into more representational painters. Maybe it was William Merritt Chase or whoever it might have been, and Sargent. And to like have a twist to go back and look at things that were weren't the polish and finish, but man, the composition in these things are just so unbelievable. The color, the expression, the emotion, and the sense of, and the personality. I remember I was at the Robert Heindel's house for a couple of weeks while I was trying to get my career started. I was going in and out of New York, and we had moved to Kansas City, and I went back and stayed at Bob and Rose's house. And I met Bob in New York, and we went to the Sargent show. And we enjoyed it very much. And like the next weekend, the review in the paper in the New York Times came out, and it was really, they were kind of like, and I was like, it's a Sargent, one of the greatest painters ever. And they were like, well, as far as furthering art history forward, he didn't have the impact as a lot of other artists. And Bob asked me what I thought about that and reading it. I was like, well, I just think that's bullshit. I said, he was great. He goes, oh, he was great. I love him, but they're right. He goes, I agree with it. And it really hurt me to think that, oh my God, Bob felt that way. He said he goes, there's a lot of, he goes, he was just better than everybody at what he did, which is a really interesting way to look at it. He said there was a lot of other artists that were very similar in what they did. They were all trying to achieve the same thing. He goes, and then somebody comes along, like Bonnard comes along, or Vuillard, or Picasso, or Braque, or whoever it was, and they turn everything on its ear. He goes, and that's what they're talking about, the impact on and I couldn't understand that. And I think we all, as artists, we kind of create our own teams. Like, this is the camp I'm in, this is the type of art I support. I think it's really important to get outside of those camps and try to figure out what makes Sargent great, what makes Klimt great, what makes, Diebenkorn or whoever you want to bring up. I mean, you can go just start listing great artists, point of view, personality, whatever it is. And I just love these things. And I see this like when I can't help from looking at this and not think about Robert Heindel or my father or Fuchs, because they were so influenced by it. This thing just slays me. But this is what he was looking at. He was also, and I think probably even more so at a period of time, was Vuillard. Vuillard or Vuillard, I've heard it pronounced both ways. you cannot look at that piece and say that Bernie Fuchs did not love this artist. Bernie's work is very indicative of this design. Very, pattern against flat shape. I love this work. And my father loved this work. He adored it. It's what, I think was the things that got him started. That was consistent all the way through his career. Pattern. Get the pattern on that, whatever it is, coat, house coat, dress, whatever. Such an amazing painting. Gustav Klimt. The design work that my father was doing, he realized that you could pair very representational work and design and have use different languages, visual languages, whether it be drawing paired with flat shape, paired with design, or iconic shapes, iconography. And I can see my dad. I can see some of the stuff he did being heavily effective. Where Klimt affected him most was not in the figure, was in his landscapes. This is the stuff I find, this stuff is so beautifully composed. And it's really, really special. Stunning stuff. Richard Diebenkorn. Massive influence. I remember my dad pointing this painting out to me, and this was so great. It made me think about it. It was so perfect in the time that I was seeing this, and I was an appreciator of Diebenkorn at the time too. But he said, that sink didn't look like that, right? And I thought that that's a really interesting statement about this painting. Is about an artist's interpretation of something as what's the right word? As average or as common, pedestrian, as this sink, this work sink. He made it beautiful. He recomposed what he was looking at. And I think it was a huge lesson to me. Killer stuff.
Aaron wants to know when we're going to host the Academy again. I was just, when you were showing those photos, John, I was like, nothing brings me back to the Academy like folding chairs and media cards. Yeah, no, we will. It just, like I was explaining in the chat, and I think it's worth being in this video for just anybody watching in the future. It'll come back. It might be different. Like Visual Arts Passage, I think is amazing because the Academy has always had like a large international following. People travel from all over the world. And it's kind of stunning to, especially John, when your dad was teaching, you'd meet people from, had traveled, like 20 hours.
Right.
You get to a rocker's, like get to a university dorm and stay there for a month. And they were on this retreat, and it's really special and it's really cool. But it also, the first thing you think as the host or the first thing I always thought of was like, oh my God, the sacrifices these people have made to do this is just insurmountable. And I've always thought it's amazing that we can, I know it's not the same, but the online program delivers a lot of that information, but to people, we have students attending all over the world.
Yeah, it's less experiential than being there in person. The experience of being able to, sit and watch over the shoulder of Bill Sienkiewicz or Gary Kelly, Chris, Vic Donai,
I'm assuming fewer VAP students have like gotten hangovers on their own through our classes. I mean, yeah.
But there's less of that. Just like there's something about being in person that's very special, and being able to meet people and say you did it, that type of thing. But as far as delivery of information, I actually find that the online delivers really high level information, and we can push faster, and everything's recorded. I mean, there's advantages to it.
Something like the academy, don't you feel like it can be, for some students, it can feel like a tidal wave, like a tsunami?
Oh yeah, and it's like so many people. It's amazing. How many people went to it 2 and 3 times? They would go for a summer and they would come back and they would get many of the same instructors and a lot of the same information a second time. And I can point out Sterling, Francis Vallejo, and Edward Kinsella, so many of the students that repeated it because they knew that they were going to learn something at a higher level the next time. It's like repeating. How many people right now are repeating Sterling's class or Lake's class? I mean, those things are designed to be repeatable until you're ready, till you have a grasp on it and understand it, until you're ready to work in the industry. Yeah. And you see something the first time, which you go out and garner all the information you can. You come back and revisit it, and you realize there's a whole nother layer.
Yeah.
And again, good teaching is teaching to the individual in what they need at the time. And I think the artists in that room were serious about it, and they knew how to focus on helping somebody. And I think we do a good job with that all the way around.
I didn't want to misdirect you from what you were talking
about.
Oh,
that's okay. I'm just, ogling Richard Evenkorn's paintings. But again, this is all about personal expression and design. My dad loved this stuff. And the last artist I'm going to show you is the person that I think maybe the last 10 years of his life affected him the most. And I believe Manola is the best working painter, or the most interesting working painter alive right now. Spanish painter that lives in New York, that is just amazing. And to see these things in person, they're stunning. There's all kinds of, I don't know if you can see it, the texture, but there's all kinds of fabric and collage sewn into the canvases. They're just breathtaking, and they're huge scale. The Marlborough Gallery, 57th Street, carried my dad's drawings, his works on paper, his drawings. And the last time I was in there, they were prepping a show of Manola's. And I got to see like 30 originals. And I was just devastated how beautiful they were, how great design, unbelievably expressive. This guy's a real deal, and he's also a great sculptor too. When you can see, the influence. And they were looking at a lot of the same artists. I guarantee you that Valdez was definitely familiar with Hans Holbein. In fact, he reappropriated a lot of his paintings, a lot of design of his paintings. Well, that's my talk. That's my father standing next to, I think this was about 5 years ago, at an opening in one of his horse paintings. And my dad was a great artist. He was a very, very nice person. And so very giving person. He's allowed so many, so many artists, he would never hide anything. He would just expose everything that he was capable of doing. He always said, you should be confident in being able to show what you do and how you do it. He said that the catch is you have to learn how to be yourself as an artist. And he goes, that's something nobody can duplicate. And I think he was right. So Timmy, I think I've come to the end of the talk. I hope
That was fantastic.
Is there any questions? I don't know if there's any questions left or not, or if there's anybody.
I really rattled the Q&A a few minutes ago. So I think that was
Good.
great. Yeah.
Good. Well, Timmy, thanks for helping me through this. And I hope that you all get a little bit better picture of who he was, who the artists that influence him. And he's, it's a great way to look at an artist. Look at an artist, try to find their influences. If you like that artist, you're definitely going to like their influences also. And those artists who their influences were. And it's a great way to learn as an artist and how to approach. And then you can see people that have learned from us and have taken our classes, especially the illustration classes. You can see where a lot of our teaching comes from. He established a lot of our assignments, lessons, exercises, and we're still using them. They work. So Timmy, I think we're done.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
That was great, John.